Hi, we're in week 4, which is the week before the midterm. And once again, we have plenty of material to go through. I hope these videos provide a helpful overview before you enter into the text and read this stuff for yourself and take your own notes and so on. But this is, I hope, also a helpful and even illuminating section of the textbook for you. I think a lot of students find it to be useful because it's a way of making sense, organizing the complexity of human life, which is pretty daunting. Particularly helpful, I think, because modern psychology provides so little help in organizing its vast set of discoveries that they've made. This is because modern psychology still has a deep allegiance to something called positivism. This is a very simplistic philosophy of science that really emerged in the modern era, especially, and became influential during the 1800s, right before modern psychology emerged in the late 1800s, and it continues to have a powerful influence on modern psychology, though it's been modified somewhat. Positivism is the approach to knowledge that says we can't make claims to know anything except what modern methods of the natural sciences can determine. Experimentation, careful observation, measurement, and statistics have been added to that mix. But if we can't document it to the satisfaction of any person interested in something, then in that way, then it doesn't count for knowledge. And so modern psychology is very unwilling to allow in any other sources of knowledge. We've made that point before. And what it ends up doing is truncating the psychology that we have and reducing it to that which can be discovered through natural science methods. Of course, natural science methods are helpful, but only for things that can be documented by those methods. And there are many important aspects of human life. Christians would say the most important aspects of human life that are unavailable to this set of methods. And so we really distort our psychology if we limit ourselves to those methods. So while I think the Christian community is very grateful for the methods of the natural sciences, all I'm saying is that we don't want to limit our psychology and our what we think counts as knowledge to those methods. I mean, the most obvious reason is because the Bible cannot be proven to be true through experimentation, careful observation, measurement, and statistics. It's kind of ludicrous. And if the most important knowledge that we have available to us as human beings is inaccessible to natural science methods, then maybe there's something wrong with us putting all of our eggs in that basket, as it were. This is operating from a deeply Christian worldview rather than allowing modernism to dictate to us what we should consider to count as knowledge. So, don't want to oversimplify any of that discussion, but it's just kind of a brief summary of some of my concerns and why our approach to psychology and Christian psychology is substantially different. Well, one of the things that is a negative byproduct of positivism is that it has no way of determining which facts are more important than other sets of facts. It's as if all knowledge lays on a flat plane, and it's all equally important, equally valid. The life of a snail in the Indian Ocean is just as important as human development. These are all just facts that cannot be, we can't prove with natural science methods what facts are more valuable, more important for living a flourishing human life, things like that. And so modern psychology provides no guidance in terms of what should we attend to in psychological research, and are there other aspects of human beings that modern psychology doesn't address that are nevertheless important, even more important than what it has discovered and is able to determine and affirm. So some folks outside of a strict kind of positivistic approach, even secularists, have argued for some kind of a way of making those kinds of assessments, evaluations about reality and about knowledge. Some philosophers, for example, Merleau-Ponty or Maurice Merleau-Ponty or John Searle and Roy Bhaskar, some that I have benefited from, and others as well. Those three are by no means Christian, but they're arguing that there is a way of making some sense of some kinds of reality being more important than others, and developing a kind of a hierarchy of knowing that is very sympathetic or compatible with a Christian approach to these matters. Christians have gone further than these folks in arguing for higher and lower orders. But let me just mention Merleau-Ponty. He distinguishes between the physical order and then the vital or biological order, and then what he calls the human order, because the higher orders are able to include those lower orders, and the lower orders sort of ground the higher orders. And this is among a minority of secularists. This is considered to be valid from a more philosophical standpoint rather than a strictly empirical standpoint, though it's by no means opposed to empirical research. It just recognizes that empirical research on its own, particularly the natural science approach, is limited in what it can determine, especially it just has no way of evaluating, except, numbers can only tell you less or more. It can't tell you what's lesser important or more significant. So, my reading of Christian thought in these areas would suggest that for our purposes, we can identify 4 orders of meaning that are distinctive and are relevant for psychotherapy and counseling. And so I want us to spend some time on that. I've written then these 3 chapters that are focused this week to try and get this framework for human beings that I trust will be something that will guide you throughout this program. The first order, the most basic order then, in the orders that we're looking at, the simplest order is the biological. It has to do then with the human body. Every human being, at least on Earth, has a body, and the relevance of the body to psychology and therapy is inestimable. We don't, from a deeply Christian standpoint, we don't have human life without a body, not in this order, in this on Earth. There may be forms of life that we believe that there are forms of life that are completely spiritual, the life of angels, the life of God, except for Jesus Christ, when God, the Son of God, became a human being, is without a body. And of course, they live in a way that is different from human life. But human life on Earth is constituted by a body-soul relation. And we have no way of understanding a human life beyond biblical revelation without a body. And as we study then the role of the body in psychology, we see it shows up everywhere. The brain is a necessary ground for all higher psychological, ethical, spiritual functions, and we've grown immensely in our understanding of the importance of the brain to our functioning in all these other areas over the last 34 years, especially because of brain scan technology, which has revolutionized the field of psychology, for which Christians are profoundly grateful. It's showing us how God created us. And Christians over the centuries have made some mistakes in underestimating how important the body is. In another way, but the body is very important in therapy because God has so constituted our bodies as to give us an understanding of value through our bodies, through our emotions, and how our emotions develop through proper human development. And also genetics is profoundly important. Our genetics is what guides our physical and biological and neurological development. So all of these aspects of the biological order are a grounding of what happens. Without a brain, human beings in this life will never develop more complex aspects of their lives. There have been children who have been born with no brain, cerebral spinal fluid filling their cranium, so that the in utero the brain wasn't able to develop properly, and they just have a brain stem. Well, such people remain in what we might call a vegetative state their whole lives until they die. They cannot think in what a typical 2-year-old can think. They'll never speak. They therefore can't form social relations and a relationship with God until they die. They're in a way trapped in a body that won't allow their soul to unfold and flourish in the way that normally occurs. So the biological order is foundational. It's very important. The next order that is super important to the field of psychology is in the textbook I call it the psychosocial order. And in my notes, I am adding on, since 2007, I've decided that I need to add on the phrase cultural, just to highlight how important culture is to this development of our souls. So I call it the psychosociocultural order to do justice to all of that complexity. But this is the order that we might equate with the soul's development. Somehow, mysteriously, shortly before birth, a few weeks maybe before birth, from what we understand in our research, the soul begins to develop. We don't know precisely when the soul is joined to the body, though we have every reason to believe that occurs at conception, when the human sperm cell and egg are united and reproduction begins to create a human being. And that's probably when it happens, certainly shortly thereafter. But the soul doesn't itself develop, from what we can tell, until the child starts to be exposed to stimuli, sounds outside the womb, within the womb, the mother's beating heart. There's evidence that the child is aware of that and has learned how to distinguish mom's voice from other voices out there. So, but of course, once birth occurs, the child is exposed to this amazing world and interactions with caregivers that allows the brain and the rest of the body to start to develop in ways that lead to psychological development, the development of emotions, forming of relationships, attachments to mom and dad, other caregivers, the development of the ability to think about what's going on around him or her, and to form memories. All of this happens after birth, and it is what we might call the development of the soul. And this is what primarily has been the study of modern psychology. And Christians studied it, for centuries before that, in their study of thinking and memory that's talked about by people like Augustine and Aquinas. But of course, modern psychology has done a tremendous job of trying to document this order, and we are extremely grateful. Want to utilize all the knowledge that we can, shorn of its secularism, in order to develop a holistic model of human beings. So this order of the psychosocial orders is very important, and culture then factors into this development, because every family is culture bound. It's shaped by the culture that it lives in or moves to, and so we want to recognize that the beliefs of a culture, the values, the assumptions of a culture, including its worldview, also have an effect on the development of the individual. But so a lot of modern psychiatry and psychology has focused on these first two orders, the biological order and the psychosocial-cultural orders. But for the most part, modern psychology has ignored the ethical order, which is, in the Christian scheme of things, the next one. Here I'm following especially Soren Kierkegaard, who believed that the ethical order was foundational to human development, particularly the development of the self, that all human beings go through. Well, he wouldn't say all, but most. And so what is the ethical order? Well, I think that this emerges in, it begins in the preschool years, when children start to recognize that mom and dad don't want me to do certain things, and they want me to do other things. And the child starts to recognize good and bad in a very socially dependent way. That's the beginning of the forming of the moral or the ethical order. But it's really in adolescence that the child's teenager's moral sense develops in a significant way, so that regardless of whether anybody else knows about something that they've done, they can, a late teenager, say a 17-year-old, can start to feel guilty about something wrong that they've done, or a sense of pride and accomplishment in something good that they've done, even if no one else knows. And this, for me, is the sign of the beginnings of the formation of a conscience, and a sense within that of what is right and wrong, good and evil. And this is what Kierkegaard described as the ethical order. We equate it with a faculty or a module called the conscience. And this is this formation is what leads us as human beings and as Christians to recognize that we're becoming responsible beings for our behavior. When we can recognize right and wrong and still do a wrong, for example, even our legal system in most complex cultures, probably all complex cultures, hold people accountable. We distinguish between a juvenile justice system and an adult justice system by recognizing that while juveniles have more responsibility than a 5-year-old, they're not fully responsible, and therefore we don't hold them completely responsible for their actions until they're at least 18. But all of this, these are indicators that the ethical realm is important, and this ethical order, from a Christian standpoint, is the sign of the law of God that's been planted in the human heart. But from a developmental standpoint, I think we have to recognize that heart develops in through childhood into adolescence and emerges then in a mature way in adulthood. So that would be the ethical order, and this is largely ignored in modern psychology. Modern psychology puts the ethical order within the social realm. So they might, for example, refer to guilt and shame as social emotions. It's very common in psychology to do that, because they believe that there's not something distinctive about the ethical order, but rather it's just a result of socialization. Now, of course, it is a result of socialization, but that's an example of reductionism, reducing the ethical order to a lower order. Whereas for the Christian, we believe that what's happening in adolescence and especially in adulthood is not mere socialization, but it's the recognition of values that are true, that are ordained by God, and we're recognizing them, we're seeing them, and assessing reality based on these true values that are embedded into the fabric of the universe, because they're a reflection of God's character. So they have real existence, and that's what makes a Christian worldview so important. Importantly different and therefore Christian psychology, in contrast to what we're left with in a merely secular psychology. And then the highest order from a Christian standpoint is the spiritual order. You knew that was coming, didn't you? The spiritual order is the order in which we make sense of God. We come to know Him. Well, at the very least, we sense some divine, sacred reality in the universe. All religions have some sense of the sacred, and they try and address that in their own human-centered ways, unless they've been given special revelation by God and the Holy Spirit enlightening that, as God did to the Jewish people, and then fully in the Christian revelation. So for the Christian, then, we believe that the spiritual order is where we connect with God. It's in a way we could say it's where we have our devotions. It's where we meet God in church. That's all having to do with the spiritual order, and biblical revelation concentrates most of its attention on these last two orders. The ethical, there's a lot of teaching about right and wrong, of course, in the Bible, but even more importantly is salvation is revealed to us in Christ in the Bible. And that's the most important aspect of human life, is our relationship to our Creator and the possibility of being reconciled to Him through Christ's death and resurrection. All of that is revealed to us through the in the spiritual order. And because it's so important, I think it's right for us to, as Christians, to see that there is a kind of a hierarchy in these orders. The lower orders are foundational; they ground and make possible the higher orders. But the higher orders are higher in that they're more important. If we only can know one of those orders, it's better to know a whole lot about the spiritual order, to know God, our Creator, than it is to know our brain, as important as that is, and all that knowledge. And I'm super grateful for neuropsychology. I love that stuff. But if we only had one set of knowledge, it's better to know Jesus, to know our Savior, than to know everything we can find out about the brain alone. So that's why I think it's helpful to see these orders as forming a kind of a hierarchy. Now, when I say that, I don't think I'm minimizing the lower orders. I think I've already suggested that our soul, I use such strong language to get this across. I would say that in this life, God has so constituted our body and soul that our soul is brain dependent. No brain, no soul development. And that I think that's what all the evidence suggests. But even so, assuming a normal sort of natural development, as we grow and develop according to God's design plan, then we enter into these higher orders, and these higher orders end up providing a sort of higher context within which the lower orders develop. They become more meaningful, more significant as we develop and we become ethical beings and ultimately spiritual beings. And to get these two kind of points across, I have some diagrams in chapter 11, and I also have them reproduced in the notes for week 4 to help bring that out. There's a hierarchy, the lower orders that modern psychology has concentrated its attention on are grounding orders. They're foundational to the rest of development. But the higher orders that the Bible focuses our attention on, and typically religions focus more attention on these higher orders, they provide the context within which the lower orders develop and come to become embedded in meaningfulness. The second diagram, which has concentric circles, I think it helps to bring out the fact that the biological order gets contextualized within the psychosocial order. And both of them come, as we enter into adolescence and adulthood, we become ethical beings as we develop fully. And so our thinking, our memory, our emotional life becomes ethical in adulthood. Our relationships and how we handle them. We're responsible for our relationships and what we do. We're obligated to care for our parents, to care for our children, for example. We become ethical beings as we develop. And then the ultimate order, then, the spiritual order, provides the ultimate context within which all of life is to be made sense of. Everything is rendered ultimately meaningful by our relationship with God and what we do with that relationship with God, how we live our lives in relationship to Him. So that famous verse in 1 Corinthians 10, whether we eat or drink, which are biological and social activities that all human beings conduct and do, or whatever we do, Paul goes on to say, we are to do all of it to the glory of God. Because that's why we're made. That's why all of this development happens. So psychology it can only find its fulfillment in the ethical and spiritual realms, and that's why we need a holistic, comprehensive psychology that does justice to all of this complexity, rather than the kind of reductionistic and truncated view of human beings that we get from modern psychology. So Chapter 11 seeks to address some of that complexity. I distinguish some secular approaches that are reductionistic. I also talk about a few Christian approaches that I think are narrow-minded and leave out the lower levels because they're not as much talked about in the Bible. But that, I think, is short-sighted because God's the creator of all four of these dimensions, and a holistic approach is going to take all of them seriously. And what's the payoff? Ultimately, for the therapist, what we want to say is, and I have at the end of chapter 11, I have a number of rules, guidelines that I suggest that are relevant for Christian therapy. Number one, we're free to work at any level that we're competent to work at. So we need Christian doctors and physicians, psychiatrists working at the biological level and giving medicine when it's needed. But we should work at the highest levels possible. If we can, let's work at the spiritual levels and the ethical levels because those are the most meaningful. God gets the most glory, and those levels have an impact on the lower levels. So there are top-down effects that affect the lower levels, and therefore we should do whatever we can to work at the highest levels possible, but we should also feel free to work, the third rule, at the lowest levels necessary. If somebody has brain damage, we need to do what we can to address that brain damage. If somebody has malfunctioning neurotransmitter system and we can address that with a medication, then let's do so. If that's going to help them to be able to function at the higher levels. So we should work at the highest levels possible, but the lowest levels necessary. And we're not going to have time for me to summarize chapter 15, which goes into how to think about how these four levels really impact the different kinds of psychopathology that develop within a Christian framework. But I leave you to read that on your own and wish you well as you prepare for the test.